Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. So let's jump in. Are the Cowboys going to hire Brian Schottenheimer? Albert, is this real right now?
I mean, I think they've certainly come to a comfort level with him, in a pretty prominent role on their coaching staff since moving on from Kellen Moore. I think that was 2 years ago now,
yep.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so, I think Schotty's, like, if you've been around him, like, he's very energetic. He's got a great personality. You would not win the press conference by hiring Brian Schottenheimer as your head coach. That's for sure. But I think he's a little bit better at the job than people give him credit for. Now, he's bounced around a lot. There's no question about that. And there is that question, with his last name and everything else, why hasn't somebody hired him already if he's that good? It's a fair question to ask. But I think he's in the mix with a few other guys. Kellen Moore is in that mix. And really, I think has some of the things that Jason Garrett had in the connection to the Jones family. And, then there's Deion, which I know you wouldn't make this mistake, Rich, but I know a lot of people do make the mistake of thinking Deion's all flash when he's actually sort of an old school coach whose foundation is on fundamentals and toughness and all those great things. So, those are the names that kind of jump out off the list to me. And I think the one thing that you have to be a little worried about is this becoming a little too insular? You know what I mean? In other words, is Jerry just going with something he knows and trying to hit a double, or is he really trying to hit a home run here? Are the Cowboys too insular right now? Do they need a little bit of a shakeup? I think those are fair questions to ask based on what we've seen. Just as far as the candidate list goes.
So Deion's out, or they told each other we're not going to do this, or what? Should we take this and waiting maybe potentially for Kellen Moore as the signs of that's Jerry's going to hire here?
Yeah, the Kellen Moore thing. So that obviously you got to slow play it a little bit on Kellen Moore because. We see if the Eagles are going to win on Sunday, first of all, and then you can't even talk to him. You can't sit down and talk to him until after that. Now, the good news is they did get him in for a first interview. So if you don't do that, then you can't do the in-person interview. But, certainly, we would have some clarity on Kellen Moore next week. They can't hire him until the Eagles are eliminated. So if they win, that's obviously another wrench in this whole thing. But there are a lot of people in that building who've worked with Kellen Moore. Who know Kellen Moore. They'd be able to set up an infrastructure for Kellen Moore. I think if they made the decision, say the Eagles win on Sunday and they fly to Philly and they do a formal interview with him on Monday and decide he's our guy, but obviously by rule they can't officially hire him for another 2 weeks because of all the background they have with him, they would be able to start to put together the infrastructure, for the Kellen Moore era in Dallas. And I think the other thing that's important here is the Joneses really love Moore, and the Joneses really saw Moore, again, the same way they saw Garrett, a guy who played quarterback for them, a guy who was, sort of quasi part of the coaching staff while he was still a player, a guy who was pushed up the ladder by them. In a lot of ways, I know I've used this term with you before, Rich, where, Jerry to some degree saw Jason as his creation, and I think that protected Jason for a while there. I think Jerry may look at Kellen the same way. And I think Kellen's really, really capable on top of that. So he's still the name that I have circled here as the one that that makes some sense. And, I know on top of everything else, Kellen's, obviously gone through some ups and downs over the last couple of years, which are to his benefit. And there are other teams that really liked him when they interviewed with him. Like the Panthers, for example, had planned to hire Frank Reich a couple of years ago, but Kellen Moore's interview kind of set them back a little bit where they had to rethink things a little. And they wind up going forward with Reich anyway. But Moore really hit it out of the park with them. So he's at least an interesting name to consider and, has a lot of built-in relationships that bolster his candidacy, not the least of which, of course, is his relationship with Dak Prescott.
What are you hearing out of Vegas, Albert?
Yeah, so I think Tom Brady's personal relationships are a factor here. One thing that I did hear was not to rule out Pete Carroll or Steve Spagnuolo because Brady has respect for them having gone up against them, having played against them. Obviously, he's competed on a Super Bowl stage against each of those guys. Spagnuolo with the Giants way back when, and then obviously, against Pete Carroll in Super Bowl 49, I think it was, right? So there's that. I also think that there's a connection on the GM side that could influence where they go with the coach. And there's a guy who's the assistant GM of the Buccaneers. His name's John Spytek. He was actually briefly a Michigan teammate of Brady's, but that's not really the foundation of their relationship. They spent a year together. Brady was the starting quarterback. Spytek was on the scout team. You remember, Rich, like the famous Tuesday meetings that Brady would have with Belichick and later Nick Caserio, right? Where they would sit down, they would go through the opponent chapter and verse, and here's what we're going to do going forward this week. Well, John Spytek was the one that ran those meetings for Brady in Tampa. And so for the 3 years that Brady was a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, every Tuesday he was sitting down, and John Spytek and a guy named Rob McCartney were doing the advanced scouting report for Tom. And so they were able to build a relationship there where I think it could be a factor for Spytek in potentially getting that job. And then if he gets that job, now do you open it up a little bit on the coaching side to see what he would want? So I'm not saying Spytek's got the job. I'm not saying Pete Carroll or Spagnuolo necessarily are going to get the coaching job either. But I think those relationships do matter.
Interesting. Okay. So keep, I guess, if you're talking Pete, that could be done now. And if you're talking Spags, you got to wait till he's done. Yep. So keep an eye on all of that. Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. Ben Johnson being introduced as we speak. Did he choose the Bears just as much as the Bears chose him? Yeah.
So this one's fascinating. I mean, we can start with the Raiders, like what the Raiders did with Ben, where at the very beginning, Ben wasn't going to take an interview with the Raiders. And Tom Brady actually called Ben's agent and sold him on the idea of it. They spent an hour on the phone, and that was when Ben accepted the interview request. He was really intrigued by Brady's vision. Brady saying that he was going to be involved and that he wasn't going to put anything that was an embarrassment to his name. Like, he was really determined to change the face of the Raiders. There are these money people that are coming in. Egan Durbin, CEO of Silver Lake, has 7.5% of the team now. Big private equity guy. Tom Wagner is Tom's partner from the soccer team over in England. He's an investor too. So he really liked the idea of what Brady put in front of what Brady put in front of him. And then, with the Jaguars, I think that was a little bit like Shad wanted to go through his process, and that process was moving along, but maybe not pacing as fast as the others. And so, I think this goes back to a year ago. Like, I think 1 year ago, if the Bears' job was open and they had offered the job to Ben Johnson probably would have accepted it. It was my understanding at that time that was the job he wanted. Then in the year in between, I think both sides sort of recalibrated, where the Bears had kind of leaned towards, we need a leader of men, more someone who's going to be able to coach all 53 and not just one. And Ben kind of looked inward at the Lions and said, I want something like this. So I want alignment between the general manager and the head coach, and I want an ownership group that's going to be willing to see its mistakes and fix them. And so that's where it kind of felt like, okay, is this a match, right? Does this really work? And I think the good thing about that is they went through the interview process kind of through that lens, both of them, and they came to the determination, not only can Ben Johnson coach the quarterback, but he also can be a leader of men in his own way. It's going to look different than Dan Campbell, but he's going to be a leader of men in his own way. And then on the flip side, Ben could look at it and say, yeah, I like Caleb Williams, but on top of that, I really, found common ground with Ryan Poles, who was sincere and real with Ben during the interview process. And I see an owner in George McCaskey who does look like he's prepared to look in the mirror and does look like he wants to fix things and does look like he's changing the organization. And so, I think in that way, it's sort of, I think it was good for both sides, going from where they would have had the marriage a year ago, maybe under a different in a different context. And now they've had the year kind of where a lot of this stuff sort of came together for them. So I think it's kind of a cool backstory to the way the whole thing worked out. And Now we get to see what it looks like with Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams working together in Chicago.
Yeah, right. And Caleb's there. His cast in his hand had to do with the cyst, I guess. So there's nothing serious going on there. And off we go. I mean, like that's the marriage that we're going to see. And what a fascinating addition to the NFC North and subtraction within the NFC North right here. Getting ready. Albert Breer here on the Rich Eisen Show. A few minutes left.